This is USS Bowfin, one of 120 Vallejo-class submarines that saw service with the U.S. Navy. She traveled nearly 100,000 nautical miles on her 9 patrols. Her commanding officers believe she should get credit for at least 34 large ships. She and her sister submarines patrolled the Pacific and were largely responsible for the victory in the Pacific in World War II.
The outbreak of World War II revealed that the US Navy's pre-war doctrine of utilizing submarines wasn't really working. According to that concept, the submarine fleet's #1 task was to attack hostile heavy warships and operate in conjunction with battleship forces, while counteracting merchant shipping was deemed a secondary role.
The fleet submarine was called a fleet submarine because it was initially envisioned that it would be a scouting unit ahead of a main battle force. And that tactic really was fairly flawed. Submarines didn't do very well at all at Midway, and at that point knew that they were better off operating independently and trying to raid the merchant sea lanes.
In order to operate in the Pacific, submarines needed good sea endurance to travel for quite a long time, disrupt enemy communications, and block routes to the opponent's mother country. All these goals were perfectly met by the US fleet submarine of Gato, Palau, and Tench classes. Specifications of submarine USS Bowfin, SS-287, as of 1944. Length 95 meters. Beam more than 8 meters. Mean draft more than 5 meters. Displacement submerged 2,415 tons. The sub has a double hull. Maximum diameter of the pressure hull almost 5 meters. Thickness of the pressure hull more than 22 millimeters. Armament: artillery, Mark 9 gun with a caliber of 102 millimeters. Oerlikon anti-aircraft autocannon with a caliber of 20 millimeters. Bofors anti-aircraft autocannon with a caliber of 40 millimeters.
This is Bowfin's 5-inch 25 caliber gun. For most of the war, submarines used 4-inch 50 caliber guns before this was developed. On Bowfin's first patrol, she sank a barge with 100 troops on board. Often in cases like that, on surface attacks, submarines would use their smaller guns, the 40 millimeter and the 20 millimeter guns.
Torpedo armament: 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft. 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes, caliber 533 millimeters. Power plant: 4 General Motors diesel engines with a total power output of 5,400 HP. 4 General Electric propulsion electric engines with a power output of 2,750 HP. 2 groups of accumulator batteries, 126 elements each. Maximum surface speed more than 20 knots. Submerged speed about 9 knots. Cruising range: surfaced 11,000 miles at 10 knots. Submerged 96 miles at 2 knots. Endurance 75 days. The number of crew 70 people.
Traditionally, submarines were named for fish or marine animals or mammals. Bowfin is a native to the United States brackish waters. It's a fairly primitive fish, but it tends to sneak into shallow waters and conduct sneak attacks, ambush attacks, which is pretty aptly named for a submarine. Bowfin was launched on December 7th, 1942, so she had a nickname, the Pearl Harbor Avenger. She was commissioned in May of 1943. As soon as she was ready, she headed into the Pacific.
By that time, the US Navy submarines in this operations theater had been organizationally incorporated into two fleets. The submarine forces of the Pacific Fleet were based in Hawaii and operated in the northern and central parts of the ocean, including approaches to Japan. The submarine forces in the Southwest Pacific were subordinate to the 7th Fleet, with their bases situated in the Australian ports of Fremantle and Brisbane. Bowfin arrived there in August 1943.
Primary mission was to conduct unrestricted warfare against Japan. So that was primarily targeted against their merchant fleet, their warships, but they also carried out a number of other special missions like spatial forces, inserting them into islands that had been captured by the Japanese. One submarine transported gold from the Philippines as the Philippines were being overrun by the Japanese. And later in the war, as a number of ships and targets available went away, submarines became to rescue downed aviators.
The primary combat use of submarines was sole anti-cruiser warfare in relatively large areas, both along communication routes and on approaches to enemy bases and ports. It should be noted that the commanders of US submarines preferred to act alone until the very end of the war. The entire ideology of their combat training was aimed at developing this skill.
When we first went to war, we hadn't really practiced to conduct unrestricted warfare, and so it took a bit of development. The initial guidance was conduct submerged attacks, use sonar bearings only to conduct the attack, which was doomed to failure just due to the inaccuracy of sonar. Accuracy of the sonar was about 25 degrees, and you need to place the weapon within about a 1 degree accuracy to have a reasonable success of a hit.
From the middle of 1942, the Navy High Command began to request that submarines spend most of the time on the surface, conducting visual surveillance and taking advantage of their high speed.
Going out, they were told to do all those things. It took them forever to get across the ocean. They only had a few days they could stay on station, and they came back, and those early patrols were not very effective. And same admirals that told them to go out and do all those things then criticized them very harshly when they came back.
Given the low efficiency of spotting targets with hydroacoustics alone, US submarines began to approach them using the periscope already in the first months of the war. Combat experience soon clearly demonstrated that preference should be given to daytime attacks using the periscope or night attacks from the surfaced position. When the war broke out, US submarines had no devices capable of providing efficient surveillance of targets during the night and passing the data to the torpedo fire control system. It was only in late 1942 that special night periscopes and a bearing transmitter designed for nighttime attacks were put into service. And search radars were only massively introduced in 1943. Thus, nighttime torpedo attacks using radar data started to be widely carried out only between 1944 and 1945.
The snorkel system hadn't been adopted yet. So anytime she was submerged underwater, she was strictly limited by the power of her energy in her batteries. She'd only go about 8 knots, but only for about an hour, at which point her batteries would be depleted. And you'd have to really get back up to the surface to charge batteries or and try to run away. There was no atmosphere monitoring or control equipment, so you couldn't make oxygen and you couldn't remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So over the time when submerged, the atmospheres got increasingly foul and really designed to be submerged during daylight hours, about 12 hours. Although I think Bowfin had a submerged period of up to 18 hours, but there were several submarines that were down for a day and a half during attacks, and they were in real extremis by the time they surfaced. So that was always, when submerged, that was on the forefront of the captain's mind, and that was a severe limitation.
Thus, periscope attacks remained the main tactic for the commanders of US submarines in 1943. The ratio of launched torpedoes to successful hits was the highest among other methods at that time. In 1943, Gato and Balao class submarines sank 131 Japanese ships using this method. 64% of the Japanese losses, with accuracy of torpedo attacks reaching 68%.
On August 25, 1943, Bowfin left the Australian port of Brisbane to go out on her first war patrol. It was very successful. She sank 3 Japanese ships, but even more important was that she completed her mission of dropping off supplies and equipment to Philippine guerrillas and also picked up 9 stranded Americans.
The Imperial Japanese aircraft were always on ASW patrol. I think they had very good tactics in terms of out searching. It was mostly visual that they were looking for. If you were detected, you were pinned down fairly close. We really relied heavily on our radar to detect the planes early, and then our lookouts. So the lookouts would rotate through positions. Our lookouts on the bridge, one of those was specifically tasked with searching the area of the sun. So he had special dark sunglasses so he could stare into the sun without burning out his eyes. But he was tasked to look, because they would, once they sighted and avoided being detected, they would try to make their attack coming out of the sun to make it difficult to see.
The nature of warfare in the Pacific substantially differed from that in the Atlantic. For a long time, the Japanese carried out their transportation missions in small groups of up to 10 ships with a weak escort. It was only in early 1944 that the Japanese began assembling their transport ships into larger convoys that tried to stay as close to shore as possible, taking advantage of the shallow waters that made submarine operations more difficult. At the same time, the organization of anti-submarine defenses and escort missions was notably improved. Single ships became rare, while escort ships and aircraft received radars.
Japanese were really kind of late to develop the anti-submarine warfare tactics. So they didn't put a lot of effort into it until they recognized it was a real problem. But by then it was really too late. Their thought was always, advance, and be aggressive. And if you were defensive, that was kind of looked downward on. It was a part of their culture that really downplayed anti-submarine warfare.
Thus, to counter the anti-submarine defenses in the Pacific, the Americans didn't need to concentrate such large forces as against the Germans and their wolf packs in the Atlantic. Only from late 1943, groups of 3 or 4 ships began to be assembled, but the coordination of their actions in a certain area consisted primarily of exchanging information, and they carried out separate attacks.
It was typically a group of 3 boats would operate together. But unlike the Germans, who were controlled centrally and required a lot of reporting, which our anti-submarine warfare forces were able to take advantage of, the submarines were left to pretty much operate in an area and develop their own tactics. Then they used very high frequency or VHF radio communications, which are short range, to communicate with each other, not having to call back to the central command.
Bowfin is credited with sinking 5 enemy ships on her second patrol, including a 10,000-ton tanker. For this most successful patrol, she received the Presidential Unit Citation. During her first 2 patrols, Bowfin completed many joint operations with another submarine, USS Bowfin. Together, they sought out convoys and sank enemy ships.
On November 1st, 1943, Bowfin set sail for her second mission. In the early morning of November 26, the submarine resurfaced under heavy rain and suddenly found herself surrounded by Japanese ships. The crew had to show miraculous skill to stay undetected and avoid a clash. Having secured the perfect position for firing, Bowfin torpedoed and sank 5,000-ton tanker Ogurasan Maru with several accurate salvos, and sent cargo ship Tynan Maru with a displacement of almost 5,500 tons to the bottom. While the alarmed convoy was still attempting to locate the deadly threat, the submarine left the hunting ground. A few hours later, she found a new target. Her torpedoes reached a former French 700-ton coastal ship that had been captured by the Japanese 2 years prior. Two days later, Bowfin joined Billfish, and together they attacked another convoy. While coming under fire from Japanese ships, Bowfin torpedoed transports Tonan Maru and Sydney Maru, with a total displacement of 15,000 tons.
By the end of 1944, the Japanese shipping had been so decimated there were very few torpedo-worthy targets. So late in the war, a lot of surface attacks with the gun action were engaged. Most famously, the ship was one of 9 ships that went into the Sea of Japan in June of 1945 through the minefields at the southern end of the Sea of Japan through Tsushima Straits. All 9 of those boats went into the Sea of Japan. Bowfin crew members remember hearing mine cables going down the side of the ship, but they managed to get through unscathed.
The situation of the land of the rising sun was deteriorating by the month. At the beginning of the war, Japan had 1,703 transport ships at their disposal for various purposes, but the losses of the Japanese merchant fleet doubled each subsequent year. The Japanese eventually capitulated, with less than half of the civil fleet they had 4 years earlier. As for the defeat of the Imperial Navy, excluding aircraft, it suffered its biggest losses precisely from US submarines. They even got to the newest Japanese battleships, Yamato and Musashi. Damaged by submarine torpedoes, these ships would stay out of service for long periods. Mobilization-type submarines sank 13 times more Japanese ships than Japanese submarines did US warships. The losses of mobilization-type submarines during the war years reached 25 units out of 179 submarines of this type in service.
At the beginning of August 1945, Bowfin left Pearl Harbor and set out on a course for our base in the Mariana Islands, where Bowfin was to start her 10th war patrol. But the patrol was never completed. On her way out to a patrol area, the captain received a message stating that Japan had capitulated. The war was over, but for Bowfin, the story continues.
As soon as Japan surrendered, she was turned back around here to Pearl Harbor. So in August, late August, she arrived back here to Pearl Harbor. Again, I can only begin to imagine how many ships and submarines were coming back into port, with the news that the war was over. So Pearl Harbor was pretty overloaded, and we already had our nation already had a demobilization plan. So before the end of August 1945, Bowfin headed back to the U.S. mainland.
In fall 1945, Bowfin arrived on the US East Coast. She served in the Atlantic Fleet until February 1947, and later was transferred to the reserve. After almost 4.5 years, the submarine returned to service as part of an effort to strengthen the Navy. Bowfin was transferred to San Diego, where she was used for training before she was sent to the reserve the second time at the end of the Korean War in 1953. In 1960, the submarine was transferred to Seattle as a training ship for the Marine Reserve. The submarine was finally decommissioned in 1971.
Bowfin was identified to be scrapped, and she was towed out here to Pearl Harbor to the inactive ships facility. But the Navy League here and our congressional delegation formed the association I now run to save the Bowfin. In August of 1979, she was donated to our association, After a lot of hard work by volunteers, she was put here on display in April of 1981. And just last year, we had our 9 millionth visitor here in Bowfin. So Bowfin continues to serve our country well into her 70s.